in Asia faces is working around Chinese or Lunar New Year, where you've got potentially up to a month of shutdown. And how are you going to balance the calendar given that that holiday is not the same time period every year? It adjusts. And for businesses with seasonality, that's very challenging.
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our number one priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the WBS Podcast. I'm Sam Gupta, your host and principal consultant at digital transformation consulting firm Elevate IQ. Remember when you bought 5 shirts last time and ended up returning all? Let's face it, consumer behavior is unpredictable. It is especially challenging for the apparel industry, where one loose thread or difference in perceived color could be the reason for return. But the supply chain planning for the apparel industry is not only complicated because of consumer behavior. Supply issues are equally problematic, including geopolitical tensions, trade wars, and cultural factors. In today's episode, we have our guest, Crissa Klein, who discusses the supply chain nuances of the apparel industry and its unique challenges. She also discusses the planning challenges, especially with geopolitical tensions in Asian countries that are the primary source of the raw materials for the apparel industry. Finally, she discusses several subtleties such as planning around extraordinary situations, unpredictable events, and unique e-commerce challenges. Let me introduce Crissa to you. Originally an economist, Crissa is a veteran management consultant who focused on helping manufacturers transform their operations to achieve efficiencies, gain multi-million-dollar savings, in addition to optimizing their strategies to increase revenue. After successful roles in supply management with Fortune 1000 financial services and consumer goods companies, Crissa is now the CEO of an apparel sourcing and production agency, managing from end-to-end supply chain for US and Canadian customers focused on sourcing raw materials, packaging, contract manufacturing, and logistics primarily in Asia. Her areas of passion within supply chain include circular supply chain, mitigating supplier risk, and increased use of AI and blockchain to increase forecast accuracy and transparency. With that, let's get to the conversation.
Hey, welcome to the show, Crissa.
Thanks, Sam. I'm so thrilled to be here, so honored to be your guest, and really excited to have a meaningful conversation today.
I'm super excited as well. Just to kick things off, do you want to start with your personal story and your current focus?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking. So I would define myself as a supply chain geek, and that I probably fell into that role a little bit by accident. I've done a bunch of things along the way. I started as an economist on the foreign exchange trading floor, and when those hours were much too painful for me, I went back to graduate school anticipating to join the U.S. Foreign Service, but decided that the public sector wasn't for me, and ended up as a management consultant. And project after project was very focused on manufacturing, especially consumer packaged goods, and a lot of supply chain transformation and looking at strategy and operations for manufacturers, mostly Fortune 1000 companies. And after 10 years on the road, I needed a break from consulting, and I moved into the supply management space in financial services, and then back to consumer packaged goods, and eventually landed in my current role as the COO of an apparel sourcing and production agency.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm super excited to talk a lot more about the apparel industry because that has a lot of unique Nuances. But before we do that, we have one of the standard questions for all of our guests. And that is going to be your perspective on business growth. When you think of word business growth, what does it mean to you, Crissa?
I've always thought that there are two types of growth. There's organic growth, and then there is what we used to call in the consulting world follow-on growth.
Yeah.
And follow-on growth is so much easier to achieve, but someone said to me early on in my career, if you don't innovate, you die. Not you personally, your business. And so having organic growth is so much more meaningful, but definitely much more challenging. And I think especially in pandemic times, it has been interesting how people have innovated, or as the popular term is these days, pivoted to achieve growth.
Okay, wonderful. So let's talk about the apparel industry, right? And we also wanted to talk about the overseas production. So give us the rundown in terms of how the apparel industry is really different overall from the manufacturing perspective. And since you have spent so much time in the CPG space, in the manufacturing space, so obviously you are familiar with the other verticals, but what we are interested in knowing how apparel is going to be different, how planning is going to be different for apparel industry. Do you want to touch on that?
Sure. So one, I think the planning cycle is very different than even fast-moving consumer goods or heavy industrial or other types of manufacturing, because you're planning by season and you're planning and designing several seasons ahead. Right now we're in spring, summer here in the US and Canada, but the apparel industry is already planning for winter or even next spring, summer on most of their calendars. So you're managing multiple seasons, multiple calendars, designing for it, trying to stay ahead of the trends, which can be very challenging, but it's also a much shorter development cycle and shorter production cycle than other goods might be, especially if you're producing heavy equipment or processed chemicals or something like that. The other thing that is somewhat different, and as you look at the trends, especially during the pandemic and as we're hopefully nearing post-pandemic, there's a trend to reshore, nearshore production, and that's a lot more challenging to do in the apparel industry because the majority of raw materials and the majority of large-scale production is only overseas now. There's very little that's still produced in the US and Canada anymore because of the size and scale of the fabric mills and the production facilities. There's small-scale production in the US still or in Canada, but not for larger mass retailers. All of that is done overseas.
So, Crissa, when we were talking about the apparel industry in the pre-show, and you touched a little bit with respect to your reshoring and nearshoring, and in case of apparel industry, you also mentioned that there are significant issues that you have to source these materials from overseas, and that is the problem that you don't see in the other industries. And obviously, the geopolitical problems are going to be in play, and you touched about several other problems that you have to consider when you are looking at the suppliers and the supplier risk as well, right? So overall, from the production perspective, I think a lot goes in planning for the apparel industry. So do you want to talk about, how to do this overseas planning in detail in different countries, and what are going to be different nuances of each of those countries or regions?
Sure. So, it really will depend on what the product is and where the skill set is. But like many other industries, the apparel industry has started to chase where is the lowest country of origin, where is the lowest cost. And some of the factors, geopolitical factors currently going on are the U.S. trade war with China, as well as political unrest in Myanmar and strikes that have been plaguing countries like Vietnam, as well as the COVID impact, where places like India are having rolling shutdowns due to the challenges with outbreaks. So, and we've seen that as well in Latin America and parts of Europe. So it is a constant challenge to keep your supply going, factories open. Raw materials at the moment are skyrocketing, whether it's cotton or synthetics. prices of fabrics, the prices of trims have gone up considerably in the last year. And then the biggest challenge from producing overseas at the moment is most definitely shipping, with a lack of availability for containers as well as huge increase in costs for vessels, cargo, as well as air and FedEx, because certainly in the apparel industry, if it's a smaller parcel, there's the option to ship by air, and sometimes you really run out of time and you end up having to air the goods. So those have all been hit very hard. We've seen over the last year that air cargo prices have doubled, shipping costs by vessel have increased substantially, and FedEx has actually decreased their fleet going from China, which is one of the major manufacturing markets. So there's fewer direct flights on FedEx, which causes a bottleneck for shipping as well. So it's certainly a challenge. The probably most mature markets for apparel production are still Mexico and China, and is been more complex of late because of the trade war, the increase in tariffs that the Trump administration put in, and those have not been rolled back by the Biden administration to date, and there is no immediate plan for that to happen. So in most cases, it's at least a 7.5% increase, maybe even more in duty from where it was in 2018 or 2019. And many companies have looked to move their production out of China. The challenge that comes with that is that the raw materials, the fabric mills, the printers are predominant, and the trim suppliers are predominantly still in China. So if you move your production to Cambodia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia, or elsewhere, you need to ship your raw materials out of China into these other countries. You're still paying an import duty to bring it into one of those countries for production, and you're adding at least 7 days, 10 days onto your production timeline. And all of those countries have a longer in-transit time to get from, whether it's Vietnam, Cambodia, wherever it may be, to a U.S. or Canadian port.
Okay, the scenario that you are describing, and I don't know if this is the first time you are seeing this problem. Obviously, you have been in this industry for a very long time, right? Have you seen similar challenges before? If you have, how have you handled these situations? I mean, do you factor in every other possibility that you might be able to think of? Because obviously you need to make sure that the pricing that you are setting up, it's going to be compliant with whatever shipping cost or the raw material cost you're going to have. So how do you accommodate for this much variability in the process?
Some of these things are things we just can't plan for. We certainly didn't plan for tariff increases, but in looking at instability and and I think this is applicable well beyond apparel, throughout my career, supplier risk has been a key focus. And historically, supplier risk was focused on just the financials of a company. And if the supplier had stable financials, it was a good idea to work with that supplier. But it's evolved, and I think COVID has further evolved what you should be looking at for supplier risk. So really looking at the geopolitical risk, where you plan to produce. Is it a stable political environment? And that's why a number of retailers and wholesalers decided not to move production into Myanmar with the political turmoil that's happening there over the last several years. In addition, looking at what percentage of that factory's business will you be. If you're the predominant supplier, it's somewhat stable. If you're the minority customer in that factory, there's a big risk that the other customers could go out of business and that factory doesn't have enough business to continue. And you don't want to find yourself in a situation where you're mid-production and your factory shuts down. Same with your raw materials suppliers. I've seen where we're taking a long position in buying some of the raw materials, the fabrics, the trims, well in advance, projecting out for up to a full year if it's a base material, so that we can continue to hold a specific price regardless of what's happening in the commodities markets, but really also trying to balance the portfolio of factories that I'm working in as one way to mitigate the instability and the risk, and focusing specific product mixes in specific markets where the cost may be higher, but I need very complex processes in manufacturing. I'll keep those in China and absorb the higher cost, whereas big bulk production for simple garments could be done elsewhere.
Okay, planning several seasons ahead. How does this planning work? I mean, typically, if let's say if you have some other manufacturers, I mean, I'm pretty sure they are going to have the problems of seasonality and variability as well. So, do you guys use any specific practices here in terms of forecasting this demand, or do you typically look at just the historical demand and try to forecast based on your best of your ability? Do you have any stories that you might be able to share where the way you wanted to plan but it didn't go as well, or you just didn't know what you were doing, and because of that, let's say you ran out of inventory or some other problems? So do you have any planning related stories by any chance from your past?
Well, within apparel, I don't have exciting planning stories, I suppose.
Okay.
I think historically, year on year, volume has remained somewhat the same. We typically plan with a percentage up and work with our suppliers to reserve capacity. I'm of the mindset that you should reserve as much capacity as you think you will need, because it's a lot easier to give back capacity and tell the factory or the raw material supplier you're not going to utilize it than it is to beg and plead at the last minute to get extra capacity that you hadn't planned for. I think one of the biggest challenges I see, especially in apparel, but frankly, anyone producing in Asia faces, is working around Chinese or Lunar New Year, where you've got potentially up to a month of shutdown. And how are you going to balance the calendar given that that holiday is not the same time period every year? It adjusts. And for businesses with seasonality, that's very challenging, knowing that you need to ship your goods in by a certain time in order to make the season and be on the retail floor. So that's certainly an annual discussion of reminding my customers Chinese New Year is coming. We have to work around that. We have to make sure that the goods are out the door. Better to be early than to be late, because you do not want to be the last order standing between workers going home for Chinese New Year and they'll just shut down. They won't give you advance notice.
Okay, so how does this work? So are they, let's say, whatever orders they have shipped in the past, are they reserving that as the capacity? What are they reserving, and does it work based on the percentage, quantity? Can you touch a little bit based on the algorithm that they use to reserve this capacity?
It's reserved by quantity, by number of pieces, and typically we look at a season. I look at season by season, customer by customer, what was the capacity required, how many pieces, and then plan upwards from that so that we have a bit of a reserve, and then sit down with each of my factories and talk about what I need from them in that time period. Many factories, if they're operating a seasonal business, have a low season, and they're willing to offer you better pricing for the manufacturing if you produce with them during the low season. So I also try and encourage my customers to plan for some production in the low season or the off season in order to take advantage of the lower pricing.
Okay, so when you talk about this planning per customer, are these wholesale customers? Because in the apparel industry, my understanding would be, I mean, you have a significant retail component as well, right? So how do you plan for those? Let's say if you have a retail component and you don't really know how many consumers are actually going to show up or how many consumers are going to buy, do you have any experience or stories there by any chance in terms of planning?
So it's interesting to look at the different customers or channels within the apparel industry. You've got wholesalers who are selling to mass merchants and department stores and so forth, and they do their planning with their customers based on what they think they can sell to them, and then they come back to someone like me and work with me on a bigger bulk view. Retailers who plan based on historical year-on-year sales and where they think they'll be, as well as brands that are either selling to their own retail or selling to other retailers, and they plan both as a retailer and as a wholesaler. And then you've got the e-commerce channel, which is really challenging to plan for. Someone like an Amazon will do an initial forecast of what they might buy, but depending on how they're entering into an arrangement with an apparel seller, they may not take possession of the inventory. So it's really challenging for that seller to determine how they should plan for marketplace like Amazon or Alibaba sales. And then brands that are solely e-commerce who are basing it off of historical sales, and sometimes that's really challenging. They may have gotten a great bump because the weather was really warm and they sell swimwear, or they got a great bump because COVID happened, or maybe they really had a business dive because COVID happened. So trying to smooth out some of those planning factors and not end up with a ton of extra inventory can be really challenging in this business.
Okay, so let's talk about the different issues that are associated with respect to planning. So obviously, apparel industry is extremely unique, in my opinion, because you have to get rid of the inventory after the season. If you're not able to do that, then you are in real trouble because you can really lose money. So obviously, there are a lot of strategies from the pricing perspective, from the promotion perspective, coupon perspective, that whatever you are going to make for the season, you are able to sell that in a specific season. So how do you plan for this? I mean, how do you sort of tie your promotional campaigns to your capacity? And when do you know that, you need to be pushing harder because you might end up with a lot more surplus than what you had forecasted before? So do you sort of pivot the strategy in between that? No. Now, I just have too much surplus. It's not selling as fast as. So do you review on a daily basis? Do you have to have the hold on your inventory on a daily basis to be able to know what is going on? Otherwise, you might be in real trouble. So how do you typically work around your sales strategies and obviously the operations and supply chain?
So the majority, apparel is either a fashion item or it's a core basic, and the core basics are consistently selling, and it's a lot easier to pull the trigger and say, I need more, let's produce more, or let's slow it down if it's a core item. With the fashion items or something that's a very seasonal item, it's being produced so many months in advance of when it will actually be sold, and so many months before it'll land in the US or Canada, so many months before it will be sold, that there isn't a lot of control over how much. There aren't indicators to tell you slow production down, we have too much inventory. So that forecast is so important to determine what you think you can sell, and it's much better in this business to sell out than to have inventory remaining, especially if it's a seasonal product. By October or November in most parts of North America, you're not so interested to have swimwear sitting on your retail floor. You've cleared it out for outerwear to show up. So then you have to play into a markdown strategy, and retailers are looking at specific points in time in their selling season to determine, is it time to run a sale? Is it time to mark the goods down to get them off the floor? I think what a lot of people also don't know is in synthetics, in goods that have stretch in them, spandex or lycra, they have a shelf life. They expire. They lose their elasticity. So you also, even if it wasn't seasonal, even if it's a basic good, you don't want it to sit on the floor for too long, because then it's a defect, then it has a potential issue, it becomes a return. So you really want to look to move the goods in the season that they're supposed to be in. And obviously most retailers would like to get full price for them, but at a certain point they need to start executing their markdown strategy to move the goods.
Do you have any KPIs that you can discuss probably?
So most of those KPIs would be more on the retail side than on the manufacturing side where I am, but they're certainly looking at sales versus inventory. They're looking at what are they selling at full price versus what did they have to sell and take markdown dollars for. And from a more of a manufacturing perspective, apparel really isn't any different than other manufacturing. We're looking at, did you fulfill orders? Were they perfect orders? Did you deliver on time? Did you ship complete? Looking at how much was produced versus what was planned, and so forth. So it really operates very similarly. Probably the inspection process is a little bit different, that random inspection is done during production and during final review before it ships, and they operate on an AQL perspective. Typically 2.5 AQL is how much they're pulling out at random to inspect and look for major and minor defects.
Okay, so the people who might not be familiar with AQL, do you want to talk a little bit about that? What is that metric? What does it stand for? And how is it relevant?
It's really it's a percentage of the total order that you're going to pull out. So if there were 1,000 pieces, you're pulling out at random a certain number of pieces, maybe 50 pieces, to inspect out of that full order as a representative portion of the order, and looking at the points of measure, looking at major and minor defects. So in the world of apparel, that could be the stitching tension, that could be loose threads, that could be color differentiations, and those specific pieces are representative of the entire order. And so that would happen most certainly at final inspection before you ship out all the goods, but it should be happening throughout the full production process.
Okay, so let's go back to the manufacturing process that you mentioned, and you said that, the manufacturing process is not really different as such for the apparel industry. But when I look at these SKUs are going to be completely different, in my opinion, in the apparel industry. It's going to have far more variability. It's going to have far more variance and sizes and the complexity in managing these SKUs. And obviously, if you don't do a good job of designing these SKUs, then you are going to run into a lot of different issues from the planning perspective, from the traceability perspective. And what I have personally seen in the apparel industry, sometimes, let's say if you are talking about a specific ERP system, and if they don't necessarily support the variants or the size or the style or the metrics inventory, then what they are going to do is they are going to create every single SKU for every type of style or design you might have. And now you can imagine, how many SKUs they are going to have. And obviously there are going to be tons and tons of problems because of this issue. And you also mentioned with e-commerce, since e-commerce used to be treated very differently overall in the apparel industry. So you had sort of the different SKUs from the e-commerce perspective. So do you want to talk about the overall SKU strategy for the apparel industry and the kind of issues that you have seen from your experience?
So I think one of the biggest mistakes that apparel companies make is having too many SKUs, over designing. And there's the danger that you then don't sell it, because if I have, as a consumer, if I have too many choices, I'm only buying one shirt, one swimsuit, whatever it might be. And if you offer me too many choices, I'm either not going to buy because I'm overwhelmed, or I'm only going to pick one of the 40 options you gave me. So it's really about trying to have a manageable number of SKUs. As manufacturers have worked with different retailers, each retailer has started to want to have a collection that may be exclusive to them, and so the SKUs do proliferate that way. But as you were saying, it's really important to plan, especially if you're using an ERP system, to have the style, color, size breakdown in there, because that's also your historical data that you're going to go back and look at and determine what sizes are selling and did you produce the right ratio of sizes. So really important to plan down to that level. What's been interesting over the years has been how e-commerce has been treated. So historically, e-commerce was the stepchild. It was the afterthought, and mass merchants would throw on some exclusive styles in very small quantities onto their websites to see how it sold. It was like a test market, but it wasn't being planned well. And back in my consulting days, quite some time ago, I was working with J. Crew when they launched their website, and they threw everything on their website and it crashed the website. So there is a balance of being able to sell what you can find in the brick and mortar store on e-commerce and having exclusives, but planning it so that your consumer finds what they're looking for easily, has a variety of options as though they were walking on the retail floor, and that you have inventory in those. So if you plan such small quantities, they sell out online very quickly, and your consumer is not motivated to come back to your site and continue buying if they constantly go there and it's sold out. So it's an even more challenging area to plan for e-commerce. And I think COVID has made that even more harder because there's the COVID factor that we've seen a bump in all e-commerce purchases. The other challenge is that e-commerce has a high return rate. People buy multiple sizes, have it shipped to them, try them on, figure out what works, and then ship everything that doesn't work for them back. So they may keep 1 out of 20 items that they bought, and that's really hard for you to know how to plan your inventory going forward and how to plan your size ratio going forward if you've got such high return rate.
Okay, so the story that you mentioned, I don't know how far back that was. Obviously, let's say 10 years back, we didn't have the technology capabilities, but now it's not too bad. The technology capabilities that we have are better. So do you see the limitations in the e-commerce storefront right now as well, that you don't want to be keeping everything that you might have in your brick and mortar just because you are afraid of, let's say, the technical limitations that your website might crash? Or now retailers are carrying all of the products? And you did mention that the high return rate, right? So obviously that is going to be a problem, but is that going to be a problem overall from the operational perspective? Let's say from the industry perspective, do you guys not like to see high return rate? Is that a huge problem because you have to sell that at 10% lower or something? I don't know how that works. So do you want to touch a little bit more on that specific problem?
Sure. So the J. Crew example was a number of years ago. I do think that retailers have a much better handle on e-commerce, but there is a balance. You need to find a balance between what's in your brick and mortar, because certainly it's very easy, and during COVID, it was the primary method of making purchases. You want to have a wide variety available, but it's nice to have some exclusive styles that are just on the web as well to reward those e-commerce customers. You don't want to overwhelm your customer with 20 pages to click through of different options. So there is a balance. And it's very hard, just like we talked about, whether it's e-commerce or brick and mortar, if you over proliferate your SKUs, there are too many choices, you've over designed, and some things are not going to sell. It is really challenging, I think, for designers to know what's going to be a hit and what's not going to be a hit. So sometimes you do miss, but they try very hard to key into the trends and you're planning months and seasons in advance. So it's always hard to know if it's a seasonal product. Did the season not go well because it was warmer or colder than expected, and therefore that particular product didn't do well? But returns are no one's friend in the world of e-commerce or retail. It's challenging to process them. You don't get as much insight as you would like from your consumers as to why the product's being returned. So did you just buy 5 of them to try and figure out your size or what fit best? Or did you buy 5 of them because you thought they looked great and then the photography on the website wasn't very good and it really wasn't the color you thought it was? Or the product quality, because you're looking at a picture when the product shows up, was the quality not what you expected? So it's challenging to get consumers. I'm sure we've all received those emails after our Amazon purchases from the seller asking for feedback about their product, and we often ignore those, but that's really valuable information to try and understand why are returns happening and how do you minimize them.
Okay. Do you have any last minute closing thoughts by any chance?
Oh, we covered so much. I think the world of apparel is a constantly moving target in terms of where production is happening, and it's a balance between the geopolitical factors, the complexity of production and where the skill is, as well as cost. But what we're seeing is that there are so many more opportunities to leverage both e-commerce as well as technology in the planning process, the production process, and the shipping process to have much more visibility and transparency into the process, which has started to help us eliminate defects, help us eliminate risk, and to be more present in a sustainable supply chain for apparel. So exciting things ahead.
Okay, amazing. And my personal takeaway from this conversation is going to be, obviously, the apparel industry is different. And the complexity is going to be really related to the overseas production. It's also going to be in the different choices that the apparel industry has. And obviously, the consumer behavior is going to be a very significant driver as well. On that note, I would like to thank you for your time, Crissa. This has been an insightful conversation.
Thank you, Sam. I really enjoyed our conversation.
I cannot thank our guests enough for coming on the show, for sharing their knowledge and journey. I always pick up learnings from our guests, and hopefully you learned something new today. If you want to learn more about Crissa, you can find her on LinkedIn with the handle Crissa Klein Lewis. It's CRISSAKLEINLEWIS. Links and more information will also be available in the show notes. If anything in this podcast resonated with you and your business, you might want to check other related episodes, including the interview with Paul Sklar, who takes us through the retail industry's deep dive. Also, the interview with Mark Jaffe from Strategic Growth Consulting, who discusses how macroeconomic trends impact consumer behaviors. Also, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word among folks with similar backgrounds. If you have any questions or comments about the show, please review and rate us on your favorite podcasting platform or DM me on any social channels. I'll try my best to respond personally and make sure you get help. Thank you, and I hope to catch you on the next episode of the WBS Podcast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.